Chris Mannix alongside Mike Costello, and with Katie Taylor set to make her ring return on October 29th, we are counting down our top 5 women's boxers of all time.
And my number 5, Chris, in a list in which they all carry pioneer status, is Cecilia Braekhus, who was born in Colombia but adopted at the age of 2 by Norwegian parents and spent much of her career in and around Europe. But one of the landmarks in her career is that the long time ban on professional boxing in what became her native Norway was lifted because of the popularity of this one sporting personality. That's how big a deal she was in becoming world champion and holding a title of one type or another for 11 years. Another landmark in her career when we're talking about pioneers, she was the first female boxer to feature on HBO's World Championship Boxing, which at the time in 2018 was 45 years old. And on that night, she beat an American, Kaylee Reese, in one of her best performances. She was a boxer who, because of that ban in Norway, had to box away from home, but showed tremendous resilience mentally and physically. She wasn't the hardest puncher of her 36 wins, which came in a row at the start of her career until 2 defeats against Jessica McCaskill. She fought, as I say, away from home. She wasn't the hardest puncher. Of those 36 wins, only 9, I think it was, came inside the distance. She wasn't the most skillful, but with desire and determination, she transformed herself into one of the legitimate all-time greats of the female boxing world.
Yeah, the first lady of women's boxing, as she was known for a long time. You look at the accolades she collected during her career, the first ever female women's boxer of the year as voted by the Boxing Writers Association. That was back in 2017. She was the longest reigning female boxing champion, the longest reign as the 4-belt undisputed champion at welterweight, the most bouts undefeated by a female world champion boxer. She was simply dominant for nearly a decade in women's boxing. If there is one critique on Cecilia Braekhus, and one thing that stops her from being higher on my list, that she stayed at welterweight for as long as she did. In women's boxing, as we saw recently with Claressa Shields, to get the biggest fights, oftentimes you have to move up and down in weight. Cecilia Braekhus didn't do that. She stayed at welterweight throughout the entirety of the prime of her career and never moved to fight somebody else in a different weight class. So that's a slight mark against her, but she is still top 5 of all time on my list.
And still did plenty in the division that she was in. And moving on to number 4, Chris, for me, it's a boxer who is ranked in my mind in terms of what she could have been, as much as on what she actually did in the ring during her time in the ring. A Dutch boxer who was based in the United States for much of her career, Lucia Rijker, and also based on what boxers have told me down the years. And when you hear from the likes of Katie Taylor today, and you ask her who were her inspirations, the name of Lucia Rijker is one of those that comes up. And we'll talk about boxers here today, many of whom have very impressive records, but those records carry relatively few inside the distance wins. Whereas Lucia Rijker, and not all of these fights were world title fights, not all of them were at the highest level, but she had only 17 fights in her career, yet still made a mark on so many in the sport. 14 of those finished inside the distance. There's an argument that she was born into the wrong era, her career through the 90s into the early 2000s. What an opponent she would make today for the likes of Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano, and many others. And she boxed a British boxer, Jane Couch, who deserves an honourable mention here because she took the British Boxing Board of Control to court in 1998 to win the right for women to box under professional licenses here in the UK. The Boxing Board of Control were very anti-women's boxing all the way up until 1998, until Jane Couch broke down that barrier. And I mentioned Jane Couch because she boxed Lucia Rijker at the Staples Center in Los Angeles on the undercard of Lennox Lewis's world heavyweight title events against Vitaly Klitschko in 2003, which just gives you a sense of back then, 2 decades ago, how she was deemed worthy of being on a bill of that kind of size. And she was trained for a time by Emmanuel Stewart when he was a very busy man, very much in demand. And the purses for women's fights back then weren't that huge, so it wouldn't have been that lucrative for Emmanuel Stewart. But he decided that he wanted to be part of this story that in the end didn't really go where I think it could have gone and where it would have gone today. But Lucia Rijker, for me, number 4 on the list of the top 5 all time.
Yeah, number 4 on my list is a woman I think is the most influential women's boxer in history. That's Christy Martin. And when you talk about pioneers in women's boxing, you have to begin the conversation with Christy Martin, who began her career in the 1980s fighting in Southern ballrooms in front of a few hundred people, fighting a lot of fights for free before she eventually signed with Don King and fought in what many women, including Katie Taylor, see as the most influential fight in women's boxing history, and that is her 1996 fight against Deidre Gogarty. That was a fight on the undercard of a Mike Tyson fight where not only was it a significant fight, but it also proved to be an entertaining fight, which I think proved to be a springboard for women's boxing moving forward. It established a precedent. It gave people an example of how women's boxing could not only be high level, but could also be entertaining. Christy Martin was also someone that didn't get into the ring looking for decisions. She had 32 knockouts of her 49 wins, so she would go out and play Rock'em Sock'em Robot with all of her opponents. I think if you just take a cursory look at her resume, Mike, you'd say, well, she just won one major title, and that was for one fight at the very end of her career. She lost her most significant fights, whether it was to Layla Ali or Holly Holm or Mia St. John, but that does not come close to defining the influence and impact that Christy Martin had on women's boxing.
And it's such a shame that Lucia Rijker, my nomination for number 4, and Christy Martin didn't meet when they should have done in 2005. And again, going back to listening to the likes of Jane Couch, who shared a ring with Lucia Rijker, and also Emmanuel Stewart, they were convinced that she would have beaten Christy Martin. But I take on board absolutely what you're saying about the influence of Martin. And this is not, this argument and this debate and this drawing up of a list is not necessarily about how good they were in the ring, as I think we'll come to talk about again with Claressa Shields and with Katie Taylor. But moving on to my number 3, it's somebody who would have benefited from the impact made by Christy Martin, as so many did. Amanda Serrano, world champion in 7 weight divisions, and a part of that era-defining fight earlier this year at Madison Square Garden against Katie Taylor. An astonishing night there on DAZN. And Amanda Serrano, the only boxer in Katie Taylor's professional career who's had a judge's scorecard go in her favor. There was a drawn scorecard at Madison Square Garden also in Katie Taylor's fight against Delphine Persoon. But I think that achievement of Serrano, alongside her many world title successes, for me, brings her up to number 3. And I think within the Amanda Serrano story is, for me, one of the debates, I think, and also part of the education of me learning about women's boxing as it gets more successful, as it becomes more prominent. Because there was a period at the end of 2018 into 2019 when Serrano fought for a world title at super lightweight, and then just 4 months later fought for a world title at super flyweight. Now, that couldn't happen for all the movements up and down in weight that Manny Pacquiao did. That was incremental year by year. So this is something I'm still learning about. We've just seen here in the UK, the most recent world title fight I've commentated on, Terry Harper moving up from super featherweight to super welterweight and looking absolutely comfortable in that new weight division. So I'm still learning about that adaptation that women can do and can move up so quickly and down so quickly in weights. But Amanda Serrano, in doing that, dancing around the different weight divisions, has made a huge impact on the sport and has played her part in terms of what she did on that momentous night at Madison Square Garden earlier this year.
Yeah, Amanda Serrano is number 3 on my list. 7-division world champion, which is unprecedented in women's boxing. And you mentioned the jumping around in weight classes. What Amanda Serrano has been able to do is unique. You see fighters like a Terry Harper jump up multiple weight classes. You do not see fighters jump down multiple weight classes. Amanda Serrano has shown the adaptability to fight at 135 or 140 and then jump all the way back down to 118 or 115. You will never see Terry Harper fighting at 130 pounds ever again. Whereas Amanda Serrano, if she announces next week that she's going to fight for a 122-pound title, I don't think that would surprise anybody because she's shown in her career that she can do it. And Amanda Serrano brought power to this generation of women's boxers. She's a tremendous boxer, won a lot of fights by decision, but as we saw on the biggest stage against Katie Taylor, she is one of the heaviest hitters in women's boxing history, regardless of the weight class she's in. I think that's what separated her from a lot of fighters in her generation. All right, now we are at number 2, Mike, and this is where the debate gets a little bit spicy. Number 2 on my list is the great Katie Taylor, former Olympic gold medalist, 2-time Olympian, one of the most influential boxers of all time, undisputed champion at 135 pounds, champion at 140, and truly one of the all-time greats. Katie Taylor turned pro and was fighting in world title fights very quickly. She has been one of the most marketable fighters that we have seen, and one of the most entertaining fighters that we have seen as well. And the margin for Katie Taylor and Claressa Shields is very thin, but right now I have Katie Taylor at number 2 on my list, in part because Claressa Shields just picked up a massive win over Savannah Marshall, in part because we've really only seen Katie Taylor dominate in one division, whereas with Claressa Shields, we've seen her dominate and become undisputed in several divisions.
Yeah, I hear that argument. I wonder, Chris, if you'd be talking as excitedly about Claressa Shields if that had happened in April as Taylor against Serrano did, and Taylor and Serrano had happened just last weekend, and then you'd be more excited about what you've just seen. Whereas for me, I flipped the two. I've got Katie Taylor at number 1, Claressa Shields at number 2. Now, most people watching this will know all about their respective records. So it's about how do we judge who is number 1 and who's number 2? As you say, it's a very thin dividing line. It is for me too. Claressa Shields at the age of 27 has almost a decade in terms of age on Katie Taylor, might go on to become, for me, the greatest of all time. But this is the greatest of all time, not the greatest right now. You mentioned earlier on about the huge influence, never to be forgotten, of Christy Martin, mainly around the United States. Katie Taylor was largely responsible because of her performances in the mid-2000s for the introduction of boxing into the Olympic Games. And this is all aside now from what Katie Taylor has gone on to do in the professional ring, which I think is the equal of what Claressa Shields has done. And I'll explain why in a moment. But to go back to the Olympic Games, I remember in 2009 when this momentous decision was made by the International Olympic Committee to allow women's boxing, to introduce women's boxing into the Olympic Games for the first time, then 3 years later at London 2012. And it was cited that one of the reasons that they had decided to introduce women's boxing into the Games after years of lobbying by the amateur boxing authorities was because they had seen Katie Taylor's recent performances, in particular at the World Championships in 2008, the year before the decision was made, in China, where Katie Taylor won her second world amateur title. It was massive in terms of the development of women's boxing. The entry into the Olympics in London 2012, where Claressa Shields and Katie Taylor won gold medals, was monumental for the development of women's boxing, to the point where, after that recent night that we've seen at the O2 Arena here in London, and bear in mind there was a sellout there for the first time this year, a sellout at Madison Square Garden earlier this year in bills topped by a female fight. We're getting to the stage where we won't be talking about men's and women's boxing. We'll just be talking about big fight nights. And Katie Taylor has been huge in terms of building towards that kind of status for women's boxing. That Olympic status, in turn, for the sport as a whole, has been so, so important. Moving on to 2016, and then last year at the delayed Tokyo Olympics, the standards are rising almost immeasurably. And Katie Taylor was such an important factor in women's boxing being allowed into the Olympic Games. Now, I'll come on to what she's done as a professional in a moment, but Chris, do you not at least concede that she's been so responsible and so influential in the introduction of boxing into the Olympics? Now, I get that at that time she was winning the world title in China. Claressa Shields was only 14 or 15, but Katie Taylor was so important in the development of boxing to the point where we are today.
I agree completely. The Olympics would not hold women's boxing if not for Katie Taylor. Her lobbying was impactful on that, in addition to her being dominant inside the ring. And you look at young women's boxers of today, they are in women's boxing in large part because of Katie Taylor. So I do agree her impact has been enormous on the sport.
And in terms of then what she's gone on to do in the professional ranks, you alluded earlier, Chris, to Claressa Shields and saying that what she's done in winning world titles in 3 weight divisions supersedes anything that Katie Taylor has done. Katie Taylor's won world titles in 2 weight divisions. And my argument here is that the level of opposition overall has been tougher for Katie Taylor. I don't think Claressa Shields has beaten anybody of the caliber of Amanda Serrano. I know Savannah Marshall is very highly rated and, like Shields, might still be improving. But I happen to think that because of who Katie Taylor is, because of the weight division that she's in, it's much more competitive at lightweight. And the one fight that she did have at super lightweight is much more competitive. If you look at the numbers, I'm not necessarily a numbers freak, but if you look at the numbers of professional boxers, female professional boxers licensed, there are just over 150 lightweights licensed all around the world. If you look at the 3 weight divisions in which Claressa Shields has won her world titles, super welter, middle, super middle, those 3 divisions combined have barely 110 licensed professionals. So there are more licensed professionals in one division, the lightweight division, than there are in all 3 of the divisions in which Claressa Shields has won a world title. As Savannah Marshall said just a few days ago in the build-up to their fight at the O2 Arena, she was saying that we're bigger than the normal woman. So the talent pool isn't that deep. She conceded that. Savannah Marshall is the one lone professional middleweight in the women's rankings in this country. If she wanted to fight for the British title, she couldn't. There isn't any opposition. And that's, for me, the weakness, if that's the right word, and maybe that isn't. The frailty in the argument in favor of Claressa Shields is that the opposition that Katie Taylor has had to face has been tougher all around.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that argument, and I have no problem with an argument that starts with Katie Taylor being number 1 on the women's all-time pound-for-pound list. But I will say this about Claressa. Her wins are beginning to age pretty well. You look at the first win of her professional career against Franchon Crews-Dezurn. Franchon Crews-Dezurn right now is the undisputed champion at 168 pounds. That was the first fight of Claressa Shields' professional career, and she dominated Franchon Crews-Dezurn. Again, I understand the depth of talent in these heavier weight classes is not what it is in the lighter weight classes, but that looks like a win. That win looks better and better every single month that goes by. Some of the other names on her list, Hannah Rankin, that win looks pretty good. Christina Hammer, that win looks pretty good. And yes, there may be something of a recency bias, in my opinion, on this, because the Savannah Marshall fight for Claressa Shields was the Amanda Serrano fight for Katie Taylor. This was her rival. This was the woman that beat her in the amateur ranks. And Claressa Shields went out and won a very convincing decision on foreign soil and in front of a hostile crowd. So I give Claressa just a little bit of an edge, in part because of the way she performed in this recent fight against Savannah Marshall. But to be clear, I don't have a problem with any list that begins with Katie Taylor. In fact, I believe that as Claressa Shields' career goes on, and as Katie Taylor's career goes on, this list, the top of it, will shift frequently over the next few years.